In this lecture, we're going to look at a zone of transition, describing a zone of transition for bone tumors and what that means and how that can help us to differentiate what kind of tumors are what, whether they're benign or aggressive, and perhaps, again, help us trying to figure out what kind of tumor it is. When we talk about zone of transition, there's two main things we'd like to talk about: whether the lesion is a geographic lesion, which is the lesion is centered in one area, and we can clearly define it as it being in that area, and whether it's nicely defined in that area or spreads out a little bit at the edges and they're kind of muddied, that's still going to be a geographic lesion. We can describe its zone of transition, whether it's sharp or kind of spilling out into the surrounding bone, but that's what we mean by a geographic lesion. Non-geographic lesions are going to be lesions which are just kind of infiltrating throughout the bone, whose cells are permeating through the bone, and we don't really get a good fix on where that lesion is. We just can see part of the lesion, we can see what it's doing, but we're not really sure its true full extent. And that's what we mean by a non-geographic lesion. So lytic lesions, we can define their border and talk about differentials based on their border and their zone of transition. They're really divided into three main types, which are categorized as geographic 1A, geographic 1B, and geographic 1C. Now, don't let that intimidate you. It's not really important whether you know what the geographic 1A or 1B or C, or even that you use that in your report when you're describing the lesion. It's really the principle that's important. The principles being that the ones that look like geographic 1A lesions are going to have a narrow zone of transition and a sharp sclerotic border, and those that are 1C are going to have a wide zone of transition. The 1A ones we're going to think of almost all benign things, and the 1C lesions are going to think of much more aggressive or malignant processes. So what is a geographic 1A lesion? Again, terminology calling it geographic 1A is not so important as how we actually describe it. Describing it is important, and describing it properly is important because that's going to help us train our mind to think about differentials for this lesion and whether we should worry about this lesion or not. So geographic 1A is going to have a narrow zone of transition, which means we can take a nice sharp marker and draw a line around it and go, this is where the lesion is, and we defined where it is. So a narrow zone of transition, and geographic 1A lesions are going to have a sclerotic border. And that basically says that this lesion is growing so slowly that the bone adjacent to it has time to remodel and put the sclerotic border around it. So it's a very slow growing lesion, a benign lesion. So this is a good example we have here in the humerus of a geographic 1A lesion. To properly describe this tumor, we would describe this as a geographic lytic lesion with a narrow zone of transition, a sclerotic margin, which is cortically based in the metaphysis of the proximal humerus. So this is going to be a geographic 1A lesion. And this is a typical appearance of a non-ossifying fibroma. When we described it as such, and we're going to think of pretty much all benign things. A very benign lesion, we can just leave this lesion alone. You don't need to do anything with it. This is a basic differential, not complete, but common things you would see for geographic 1A lytic lesions. And all these things on the differential are benign things. Notice infection is going to creep on there. Infection is going to be pretty much in every differential for a bone lesion. Infection can look like all kinds of different things, and it's always good to keep in mind that what you're looking at may not actually be a tumor, but it may in fact be infection. So differential diagnosis for a geographic 1A lytic lesion is going to be a bone cyst, a unicameral bone cyst, solitary bone cyst, same thing, a Brody's abscess, cartilaginous lesions such as a chondroblastoma, chondroid myxoid fibroma, and enchondromas, again all benign cartilaginous lesions, non-ossifying fibroma or fibroxanthoma, whichever you'd like to call it, and fibrous dysplasia. Fibrous dysplasia is going to be on all kinds of different lists because fibrous dysplasia, like infection, can look like a lot of different things. On our right here, we have another example of a geographic 1A lesion. So we have a geographic lytic lesion, narrow zone of transition, sclerotic border, which is centered in the epiphysis of the proximal humerus. In this case, this was a chondroblastoma, but this could have easily been a Brody's abscess. Those are probably the two best differentials for this lesion, though you can think about other things as well. But again, geographic 1A lesion, narrow zone of transition, nice sharp sclerotic border. We're going to think about benign things. Next step up are geographic 1B lesions. Geographic 1B lesions are going to be the same thing as 1A lesions, except they're not going to have a sclerotic margin. As we said, the sclerotic margin basically means that the bone is having time to remodel around it. It's a very slow-growing tumor. So ones without a sclerotic margin, perhaps they're growing a little quicker. The bone around it doesn't have time to remodel as much. So geographic 1B lesions, narrow zone of transition, non-sclerotic margin. Again, most of these things are going to be benign conditions, benign lesions. Here we have one in the hand, geographic lytic lesion, which is slightly expansile, has a narrow zone of transition, non-sclerotic border. This one is centered in the metaphysis of the phalanx of the hand here. This was enchondroma in this case, which is a common benign lesion in the hand. But pretty much all our things on a differential for geographic 1B are going to be similar to the geographic 1A lesions. So we're going to have a bone cyst, unicameral bone cysts are on that list. Cartilaginous lesions, chondroblastomas, chondromyxoid fibromas, and enchondromas are going to be on that list. Fibrous dysplasia, again, going to be on that list because it can look like a lot of different things. Something new on this list is a giant cell tumor. Giant cell tumors are benign tumors, although can be very locally aggressive. And they're going to be typical as a geographic 1B lesion, lytic, narrow zone of transition, but a hallmark is they don't have sclerotic borders. So if you describe a lesion with narrow zone of transition and sclerotic borders, please don't say giant cell tumor is one of your differentials because it's very unlikely that's the case. They almost never have sclerotic margins. You will notice at the bottom of the list things that creep on here are metastasis and multiple myeloma. Now, mets and multiple myeloma are going to be by far the most common bone tumors you're going to see. Way more common than any other thing. So it's always good to think about mets and multiple myeloma, especially in like middle-aged or elderly adults. You really want to think about mets and multiple myeloma. Even if it looks really benign, maybe you're not considering it, but at least it flash through your mind, could this be metastasis, could this be multiple myeloma or plasmacytoma? Because statistically they're more likely and they can look benign sometimes. This one on the right, we have this geographic lytic lesion, which is expansile, narrow zone of transition, non-sclerotic border in the epiphysis of the proximal fibula. This was a giant cell tumor, a good location for a giant cell tumor, good appearance for a giant cell tumor, no sclerotic border, so we can safely say this could be a giant cell tumor. I think a good differential for this would be an aneurysmal bone cyst as well. That would be a good differential. That's also on the list. Bone cysts, both aneurysmal and unicameral bone cysts, will look like geographic 1B or can look like geographic 1B lesions. All right, so the next type of geographic lesion and the more aggressive type are going to be geographic 1C lesions. And again, all this means is that there's a wide zone of transition to this lesion, not a nice narrow zone of transition. So we see the lesion is geographic. We know it's kind of centered in that portion of the bone, but its borders bleed out into the adjacent bone, and we can no longer take a marker and nicely draw a line around it, tracing its outlines. We're not sure. It kind of bleeds in there. And these are scary looking things, and because they're scary looking things, we're going to think of much more aggressive and malignant processes. Could there still be a benign process that could look like this? Sure, it's possible. For example, giant cell tumors. Giant cell tumors can be very locally aggressive at times, so you can have aggressive giant cell tumors. Infection is going to be on this list as well too. Infection can look quite nasty. So we have here on the right, this is a geographic lytic lesion. It has a wide zone of transition. We're not sure where it ends. It kind of bleeds into the adjacent bone. This one is clearly broken through the cortex of the bone, and maybe we can even infer a soft tissue component of this one. This was a telangiectatic osteosarcoma. So we look at this, we see, hey, this is something nasty. We're going to describe this as being more aggressive, more malignant, more scary. And then we're going to consider our differentials for a geographic 1C lesion, which are for the most part going to be scary things. So when we start out talking about our differentials for something we say is a geographic lesion with a wide zone of transition, we should first consider the more aggressive things. So on this list, chondrosarcomas. So chondrosarcomas are going to be on this list. Very actively growing enchondromas are going to be on this list. As I mentioned, giant cell tumors. Giant cell tumors can be locally aggressive and look quite scary sometimes. So if they're in the right location, that is, they extend to the articular surface, we can think of a giant cell tumor. Aneurysmal bone cysts can occasionally look a little scary. Osteosarcoma, so osteosarcomas on this list. Remember, telangiectatic osteosarcomas are not going to have any osteoid matrix. And then, of course, Mets and multiple myeloma or plasmacytoma are going to be on this list, as well as infection, which is not here, but you should also consider. So this is going to be your main differential for a geographic 1C lytic lesion. All right, non-geographic lesions. So when we say non-geographic lesions, we're really thinking of lesions that are diffusely infiltrating throughout the bone, and we don't get a good sense of where that lesion is. Now, at some point, I think there's going to be some overlap, whether this is a geographic lesion with a wide zone of transition, or is this a non-geographic lesion which is very permeative and infiltrating through the bone. At times, there's going to be a bit of overlap, but we should try to categorize them in one or the other. I wouldn't get too obsessed about whether, well, is this really geographic with a wide zone of transition, or is this really permeative, because both of those ways we describe it are going to make us think of dangerous things and more aggressive things. So don't get too hung up on that. But these lesions are going to be fast-growing, infiltrating lesions. They're going to spread throughout the bone. We're not going to get a good sense of where they are. You may have aggressive periosteal reaction associated with them. Here we have on the right, we have a radiograph which shows this permeative lesion in the distal radius. We don't get a good sense of where it is. It's just diffusely permeating throughout the bone. It's lytic. It has this periosteal reaction associated to it. In addition, there's this periosteal reaction associated around the distal ulna. I'm not sure we see any of the lesion in the ulna, but there's certainly something adjacent to it causing the periosteal reaction. So this looks really scary and aggressive. This turned out to be a bad osteomyelitis and not a tumor, but still a good example of a more permeative lesion kind of diffusely infiltrating through the bone. Just to talk about the difference between permeative and moth-eaten, what they look like. This is a cartoon which shows the permeative, which has kind of small holes, and moth-eaten, which are slightly bigger holes, and then just a cartoon of a normal bone showing the normal trabeculation pattern. I don't think it's too important to get hung up on whether it's permeative, whether it's moth-eaten, how big are the holes. That's not really the main point. The point is, you look at this, it's going to be permeative or moth-eaten lesion. Either way, you're thinking of aggressive things, and pretty much the differential is the same anyway, so it's probably not that big of a deal. But just so you know, some people try to classify moth-eaten as more bigger holes around there. Differential diagnosis for these lesions, both permeative and moth-eaten lesions, are all nasty things. So when you describe something as permeative and moth-eaten, you're going to be thinking of aggressive lesions. So Ewing sarcoma, round cell tumors, lymphoma, leukemia, all those are going to be on here, and a favorite appearance of them, diffusely growing and infiltrating throughout the bone. Again, osteomyelitis is on here. Infection can look like all kinds of things, can look very aggressive. An infiltrating osteosarcoma could look like this. Mets multiple myeloma, again, super common. Mets myeloma. Anytime you see something lytic or permeative moth-eating in an older adult, please think of metastasis and multiple myeloma because they're so common. Sometimes really aggressive, for example, really aggressive hyperparathyroidism and osteopenia can look very permeative, can look kind of scary. That's just so much of the bone is disappearing. It can look like an infiltrating lesion when in fact it's really just osteopenia. So in metabolic disorders, you can think of things like that. EG or Langerhans cell histiocytosis will occasionally look kind of scary as well too. So that's on the list. And some more of the sarcomas that don't infiltrate the bone can look scary as well too. All these things are scary, so nothing benign on here.